Welcome to Terms of Reference. I'm your host, Stephen Laddick. Timo Lüge is a communications and advocacy consultant. He has been working in the humanitarian sector for 7 years, and his clients include UN agencies, NGOs, and the Red Cross Red Crescent movement. Prior to this, Timo worked as a journalist for nearly 10 years. During emergency response operations, Timo works mainly on public information and media relations. When in Europe or the United States, he focuses on how digital technology can be better used to support emergency management and humanitarian relief operations. I spoke with Timo in Berlin, Germany. Hi there, Timo. Thanks so much for being on the Terms of Reference podcast with me today.
Thank you very much for inviting me. This is great.
Timo, tell us, start us off by briefly explaining what is it that you do every day as a communications expert?
Well, I work as a communications and advocacy consultant for humanitarian agencies, and with an emphasis on digital communication. That basically means I do a lot of general comm support, also in the field. I've just come back from the Philippines where I was for 3 months. And in addition to that, I've always had a huge interest in digital technology, and that is why I have kind of positioned myself a little bit also in how can social media be used, how can crisis mapping be used in emergencies and all these things. And so on a typical day, it really depends on whether I'm in the field or whether I'm in Berlin, and that dictates very much how my days look like.
How much are you on the road? You just said you're in the Philippines for the last 8 months. Was that so? Sort of two questions there. Were you focused exclusively on the hurricane recovery, or were you doing other work while you were there as well?
I was there I was there for the last few months. I was there actually for 3. And I was there for the Haiyan response and also for the Bohol earthquake response. And that was for the shelter cluster, which is one of my clients, and they coordinate the shelter response in large-scale emergencies, and they asked me to support them around communications and advocacy for the shelter sector.
You just said the shelter cluster is one of your clients. Is that an ongoing contract? Do you maintain sort of a retainer with some clients, or are all your contracts, do they have a specific end and beginning?
It's a mixture of both. At the moment, I'm not working for the shelter cluster, but in general, I have one client with whom I have a longer contract, but that is kind of also like a lower volume of work that I'm doing for them every week. So it's a little bit of ongoing support. But I'm mainly doing shorter contracts. But to be honest, that has also been very different from year to year. Last year, I had a client for whom I worked most of the year, whereas this year it has been much more smaller packages of work.
Do you find that you spend a significant amount of time seeking out new projects and new gigs, or have you developed your network substantially over the last 13 or 14 years so that the work is flowing to you regularly?
Well, right now I'm in the lucky position that a lot of the work is actually coming to me. I have, before I started to work as a consultant, because, this is now my 3rd year working for myself as a consultant. I worked for, the Red Cross. Before that, I worked as a journalist. But I found that the first year as a consultant, I really had to put myself out there a lot and try to make a lot of contacts and really, try to convince people that I can do this, or also, apply to a lot of consultancies that were published. Whereas now, fortunately, a lot of my contracts are from recurring clients and also word of mouth and also through my blog.
How do people find you through your blog? Is that, again, through promoting and you say, hey, go check out my blog, or is it organic traffic that's coming to it?
I think it's a little bit of both. It's so for those who want to look at it, it's Social Media for Good, which is SM and then the number 4good.com. There's a fair amount of people who are recommending it to other people. I'm actually not updating it as much as I should. But people seem to like what I'm writing there. And occasionally, I get an email that says can we have a call and can we talk about this? And, I have an interesting project here. But, the vast vast majority of work I'm getting is actually not through the blog, but through personal recommendations. But it certainly does happen. And I think with people who have personal recommendation, having a blog is also something that shows them a little bit, what is the kind of, work I do, can I write, which of course is important if you're a communications person. What is my thinking on certain things? So I think for a lot of people, it's a good way to get a first impression after a personal recommendation.
You said that you haven't been updating it very much lately. Did you start your blog as with the intention of sort of making it a go-to site around communication technology, social media, etc., for the humanitarian business, or was it specifically designed as a reference tool for yourself in your practice?
No, it's mainly designed as being a useful source for people who want to know about communication and advocacy and digital technology. It's not a portfolio. To be honest, if I was to also always try to do that, I think it would just be a lot of time that I would have to invest in just making it always shiny and pretty. And I think most people don't really care that much about me. So they're more interested in the topics I'm working with. So for me, the blog was more something where I can talk about topics I find interesting, and also to then have comments from other people who work in the same area and to see what are they thinking. So it's a bit of a sounding board for me.
I'd like to switch gears for just a second and talk about the work that you are doing for your clients. You focus as a communication consultant, and you focus specifically on social media. Do you think that aid and development organizations do a good job of social media? And beyond that, with communications in general?
It's a difficult question because communication is so broad. So in answering it, I'm going to leave out fundraising, because fundraising also is connected to comms, or can be to certain parts of it. I think in general, I don't think that a lot of humanitarian organizations are doing a very good job at communicating. I actually find that particularly when looking at working with the media, that a lot of times humanitarian organizations get criticized for the wrong things. I think there are a lot of things we can be criticized for, but when I look at the media, a lot of times, what we are being criticized for is just things that are outside our control.
Can you give me a specific example of either a criticism or something that was undue criticism?
Yeah, like if you have a week after disaster and everybody's saying, why don't these people have whatever, houses yet? And you always have that. A week after disaster, you always have the first people saying, why is this taking so long? And instead of addressing that and explaining that, I think a lot of times, humanitarian organizations just either throw up their hands in despair or think the media doesn't understand us. And my experience is that, when I sit down with journalists and walk them through what we are doing and really take the time to do that and say, this is the process, this is why this is the process. There's a reason why we're not simply throwing random stuff out of the back of a truck. And if I sit down with them and explain that to them, then I find that most journalists who are, in my experience, normally very, very constructive and very interested in the work we're doing, are also very understanding of the constraints. The problem is that very few organizations take the trouble to explain this process to them. I find that when I have an interview request, I frequently spend about an hour with each journalist. And, of course, if you don't have a dedicated communications capacity within your team, that's very difficult to do. Let's say you're a team leader for whatever program. You simply don't have the time to spend an hour with a journalist because you have your real job to do. Whereas, of course, that is my real job. And I think, just, explaining all of that, particularly in big disasters, because the system is quite complicated and quite complex. And I find that extremely beneficial.
So if you feel you're often criticized, what are some successes that you've seen in the past? Are there ones particularly from your work where you said, "Wow, we really knocked the ball out of the park with this particular piece of communication," or we were really able to communicate what's happening on the ground here successfully to not only journalists but the broader population?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always happy with, if the result is something that displays what is happening on the ground in a realistic light, which in most cases means, not sugarcoating things, but just saying, this is how it is, and this is why it is. Two things that come to my mind were 6 months after the earthquake in Haiti, there was a New York Times cover story which I felt portrayed the shelter situation in Haiti very well. And also, again, it wasn't about saying, everything's wonderful, because it truly wasn't. But just saying, this is what is happening, and this is why it is. And I also think that now in the Philippines, when Typhoon Haiyan happened, we very much emphasized that a lot of the organizations there were working very much in, trying to teach people how to build back better. And that whole approach that, rather than just bringing, a little bit of corrugated iron sheeting and hammers and nails and these kind of things, that you also try to teach people to kind of rebuild better so that the houses are safer. That was a very important message that we had. And we were able, again, after, I think it was around the 3-month mark of Typhoon Haiyan, to explain that quite well. But again, that is something for which you need a little bit of time.
When a client hires you, what are they getting specifically? You've explained sort of your expertise, but what are your greatest strengths when you come to a client, when you come to the Red Cross or any UN agency or something like that? How do you pitch yourself so that you're putting your best foot forward?
I mean, one thing I didn't really talk about until now was also like the digital part, like the social media part, and I think that's a little bit where I have a bit of an advantage over other people. Because I have, I've always liked digital technology. I had my first modem in 1987, if I recall, or it might be 1988. And so I've been online for a really, really long time. So I'm kind of, I know that world really well. But on the other hand, I have also have a fair amount of field experience. I've been in Haiti, I worked in Liberia. Last year I was in Mali and in Myanmar. And, some of these missions were longer, some of them were shorter. But I have a sense for, what is happening in the field and what's realistic in the field. And I find that a lot of times when organizations are talking about technology or thinking about technology, they are, just looking at them as, a new shiny tool. So to be fair, a lot of times it's actually not the organizations who are doing that, but it's like technology providers or they're, academics who are, very excited about, something that is theoretically possible without thinking through whether this tool is actually needed. So I'm trying to basically make a lot of really shiny technology realistic for organizations I'm working with. And a lot of times I tell them, it's not about having a Facebook page. It's not about having a Twitter page. Yes, you might decide that you want to do that, but let's talk about, your communication goals first. How are your communication goals actually supporting your business goals? And then sometimes you discover there is no communication strategy. And then the answer is, well, then maybe you should start with that. And then see which tools, of which social media is one, can help to serve those goals. And, I've had clients to whom I said, like, well, for you, a Facebook page makes absolutely no sense. And, and then I try to explain to them why I think that is the case. And the same is, with other things like, crisis mapping or crowdsourcing. I think, you can look at all of that. But I'm trying to ground it all in a overall communication strategy that has some use also in the field and I think that's what makes me a little bit different, because a lot of people just see it as an isolated piece, and I try to integrate it more with the overall communication strategy.
Are there critical pieces to a communication strategy that are relevant to essentially every organization?
Yeah, I would say that you know how to connect your communication strategy to your business goals. Communication should always support your business goals. And if it's just in isolation of that, then you're doing something wrong.
I've purposefully noted that you've talked about, how your communication strategy connects to your business goals. Have you found that some of your clients bristle at that particular language, basically giving you pushback? Hey, we're not business. We're an NGO. We're an advocacy group. Does that ever play wrong?
Not so far. It's still like I think in a lot of organizations you still talk about who's the business owner of this process, or so I think that talk is fairly widespread.
Who do you think is better at communications in your experience? Is it a larger organization like IFRC, or in general is it a smaller, more nimble, maybe like a local NGO or something like that?
I don't think there's really a hard and fast rule for that, because also big organizations might not necessarily have big communications teams. I think it really depends very much on the individuals you have, and also about the amount of trust that management has in the communication team. So how much freedom do they have? Do they have to get everything signed off by senior management, or can they also just run with something? But also very much with the mandate. I think a big international organization or UN agency where member states are members will always have different communication constraints than a very small organization. On the other hand, a big organization might be able to have a better budget. So I think it really balances out.
Has there ever been a time when, as you're walking through a strategy session or one of these communication sessions, where you've recommended that an organization essentially shut off their social media for a time, or completely get rid of it?
No, I have recommended occasionally that people switch off comments on YouTube, because unfortunately YouTube is, as far as the commenting is concerned, pretty horrible. But you can, for example, only approve comments after moderation. So people can still comment, but the comment wouldn't show up. I've recommended that a few times, because there's just so much garbage and so much spam on YouTube that it's just impossible. But that's pretty much the extent to which I ever recommended that.
Mm. Is there a threshold that you either recognize or help organizations to recognize when they need to have a full-time communications individual, either on staff or someone like yourself that they retain?
No, I don't think there's a threshold for that. Because what do you have in mind when you say threshold there?
Is there a particular size of an organization? There's an awful lot of 1, 2, 3 person NGOs out there. Is there a dollar figure? Because that 2-person NGO could be, have a grant for $5 million as far as we know. I'm just wondering, is there a size or a particular reach or breadth and scope of their portfolio where they should, the leadership of the organization should sit back and say, it makes sense for us to be able to communicate effectively about everything we're doing? Or is that something that you build into the strategy just from day one, no matter who you are?
I think it very much depends on what your program is. I think everybody is communicating, right? Everybody who runs an NGO is communicating to somebody. Else you wouldn't run a program. So I think it makes sense to think about communication and not just we're going to go somewhere, we're going to talk to people, but again, to think about what do you want to see and these kind of things. But you don't necessarily need somebody on staff to do that. I think that can also just be a training, right? Where people are saying, let's think through how we will be approaching communication going forward. And it's, I think it's very different for, let's say, a wash agency that has a big wash program where they need to do hygiene promotion all the time, or a very small organization that does more like behind the scene diplomacy and, is mainly talking to donors. They're very different. They're very different models. However, I do find that, and it's encouraging that more and more people are now looking at communicating better with the affected population, in addition to just, worrying about how to communicate with the media. And I found that is an area that has been growing a lot over the last 4 years.
Do you think that communicating with the media is, in many organizations' minds, essentially communicating with the donor?
Yes, in many organizations, I think that is true.
How has it changed? Is there a way that you can give me an example of how organizations have started to shift with communicating to the beneficiary? You gave a couple examples of, if you're a wash agency, you have to have daily advocacy on that, and there would be obvious differences if you're a behind-the-scenes diplomacy organization. But are there specific examples of programs in the world that you can say, hey, this is really great that they're communicating with the beneficiaries?
I think, there are a number of organizations who are doing that very well. I think actually IOM is doing a very good job there in general. I also think that Handicap International is very good at that. And there's starting to be more and more a real role for it. I think also, OCHA has started to put much more resources into that over the last 2-3 years. So it's coming together, but it's still comparatively new. And of course, there's the CDAC network, which is communication with disaster-affected communities, who are doing a lot of very, very good work and are working as resources for everybody working in this area. But it's still a long way to go. But, realizing that, yes, you also need to have a consistent message for everybody. I think that's a big realization also with the more widespread access to a wider range of media for affected communities, that, you simply cannot say one thing to the donor and say another thing to your affected communities anymore. Because what you say, in the one direction, if it's, in any form public, will also be read or heard by your affected communities. And that means you need to be consistent, and that means you need to think about, how do we message across the board, and also so that everybody is able to understand what we're saying. So I think it's a very interesting process.
There's a subtext there that I'd love to hear from your perspective. Could you give me an example of either a tweet or a post or a video, or maybe just a communication, a media blast that went sour or created a crisis that you were on call to take care of and had to sort of put out the fires?
Not right away. I have had a number of kind of outside problems. So, because what you're describing is basically a problem that kind of we created and that we had to deal with. That hasn't really happened, knock on wood. But yes, of course, occasionally, there was a problem, and then, we were in some form, we had to respond to that, but which didn't necessarily have to do, directly with us.
Can you give me an example of that?
Yeah, we had, again, in the Philippines, there was an issue with a government-built housing, which people were, not very happy with. And, we looked at those together with other organizations, and we determined that they do not, fit international standards. And the good thing was, we submitted that report to government, who actually agreed to change those houses. But then, in the meantime, between, that discussion taking place and the buildings being fixed, there was a media report that said the international organizations are saying, this is horrible and the government is not doing anything. And of course, the opposite was the case, because we were right in the middle of this dialogue to address that, and the government was very open to addressing that. And then, it was an uncomfortable situation, because it seemed like, we were in opposition to each other, which we really, really weren't. And then you just have to do a lot of explaining towards, all kinds of audiences to say, like, this is the process, this is actually, the way it should be, that we are here in advisory capacity. We see something that, we think is not, it's not up to the standard that we would like to see, and then we point these things out, and then, they're being addressed, and that's the process. And this is not an opposition. This is a constructive dialogue. And then, explaining that is quite tricky. And, of course, also, through social media, complexity is very difficult, because what I just explained was definitely more than 140 characters.
So, yeah, definitely not a tweet. Do you feel that there's a large portion of conflict mitigation or conflict resolution, or maybe even conflict prevention in the work that you do, with making sure not only that you're communicating for your client effectively, but also foreseeing potential communication hiccups? Yes,
particularly when you talk about programs that are going out, or when for example strategy documents are often not drafted or by communications people, or never drafted by communications people, because you're not the ones who should be doing that. But then sometimes the way things are phrased can be misunderstood, and I think particularly, I'm not an English native speaker, but there are a lot of people who are struggling with English much more than I do, and a lot of times when they write reports and then publish those, then very frequently this can be really misunderstood, and that can be problematic. So I think if you have something that is controversial, then having your comms person take a look at it just to see whether it raises any red flags is a good idea, in my opinion.
How do you put on the hat of your client to represent them when you're in a place like the Philippines, or in a place like Haiti, and you're an independent contractor? Do you feel secure in saying, "Hey, I'm speaking for X organization," or is that a part of your contract that says you're given that right?
That's part of the contract, and they need to have that confidence in me. And
so that's a specific part of your sort of negotiation with them, that's saying, "Hey, look, I'm going to be your mouthpiece. This needs to be a piece of that."
Pretty much, but I mean, so far I never really had to negotiate for that. So far, when people contacted me for field work, I mean, that's this is not strategy work, for field work. It was always with a desire for me to be there, and then also do the media work for them. Of course, if you're like in big organizations with many different wings, and then if you arrive, you might have to explain to some other people that, "Hi, I'm here. This is my brief. I will keep you in the loop." And and obviously, we should talk with each other to see that we're all saying the same thing. But don't be surprised if you all of a sudden see my name being quoted somewhere. And and I think that's the way to do it, so that everybody is always in the loop.
Sounds like you have sort of an ideal situation. Many independent contractors that I talk with, or that we've worked with over the past, is sometimes their ideas or the advice that they give, or even the work that they produce, ultimately ends up hitting a desk or being put on a shelf and not used at all. But it sounds to me like you really don't ever have that problem.
I do have that problem. I've had cases, but as I said, it's just different what I'm doing. There are different kinds of contracts. I have also written strategies where people then said, like, "Oh, this is great, thank you very much. We're just going to give it one last final touch," and then it landed in a drawer, and that's where it stays. But I think that's at the end of the day. If I'm doing the work they're asking me to do, and they said they're happy with it and they don't want any more changes from my side, then I have to accept that. I want the things that I'm working on to be used, but as long as it's the exception that it doesn't get used, I can live with that.
I want to go back to your mention of you've been online, or you had got your first modem in 1987. I'm happy to say that I think that I'm as big a geek as you are. I can remember dialing up the bulletin board on the phone and then putting it in the box and closing the box over the phone.
Yes. On a Commodore 64 with a 300 baud modem.
Not to drop names, but I had a TRS-80 from Radio Shack.
There you go.
With the tapes, and you'd have to wait for the tape.
Oh, yes. That was fun.
What's happening now in the field as far as technology use? I mean, you and I could have even said, 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, you'd go to a place like Haiti, you'd go to a place like, Cote d'Ivoire, and you could pretty much guarantee that you wouldn't have an internet connection if you were in the field. That has rapidly changed. Is everybody able to tweet now? You just have to assume that everybody is on Facebook?
Well, it depends on from what perspective you're looking at that. I think from a reputation management point of view, I would say, yes, assume everybody can use Facebook. But from a public information point of view, you cannot assume that. I think, what has changed is that mobile phones, and, I'm not talking about smartphones right now, just normal, feature phones, have become very, very prevalent. Which I think has some really exciting possibilities for using SMS in very interesting ways, also using cash. Now, I have to say I know nothing about mobile cash, but as a technology, I find it really interesting. And I think, one of the problems is that, people come up with really exciting kind of state-of-the-art solutions, for things. And when I think let's look at the technology that is not necessarily state-of-the-art in Europe or in the US, but let's look at, what is widely used in the countries where we're working. And I still think in a lot of cases that means SMS more than, for example, Twitter or Facebook. However, this is very country specific. Another interesting thing, again, about the Philippines, I'm talking so much about it because I've just recently come back from there, is the Philippines is a country where everybody has a phone. It's also a country, until recently, they were the country that sent the most SMS per person worldwide. And they have, good technology infrastructure and everything like that. But then when I was in the affected areas, and I talked to people, and I also talked to, other organizations who are very interested in using new technologies, and they weren't really using social media for outreach to the affected population. And I was curious about that, also talking to national NGOs, why are you not doing that, even though you have, 130,000 Twitter followers. And what they said is that even within their country, what would happen is that, in the big cities, in Manila and so forth, people would be using it, but not necessarily in the poor rural areas. Mm-hmm. But what would happen is that, you would have the family would be living in the rural area, but whatever their eldest son was in the capital earning money, and he would use social media to kind of inform himself and then send his family a text message. Huh. Now, that is not a program design you would ever come up with. But it is what happened. And it also worked the other way around. They have a system where people over social media could report needs. Now, the people in the affected areas couldn't do that because also they didn't have electricity and no network. No internet. In a lot of cases, they still had a phone network. Else they wouldn't have been able to text. So these kind of things are happening. So I think it's important to think about these newer technologies that might not be exactly available where your program is, because it might still influence the people in some way. Also, diaspora is a huge example. For example, I know I've never worked in Somalia, but I know that the Somali diaspora is apparently very, very active on Facebook, and they are also, by the way, very interesting donors potentially if you're fundraising from individuals. Because they're obviously very, very engaged.
This is something that we found in Kenya as well on a project that our other organization, our sister organization, International Solutions Group, worked on, where the Kenya diaspora ended up being a flashpoint donor of a substantial amount during the election crisis.
But that also, I think, kind of the flip side of that, and that comes back to what I said earlier about reputation management, because everybody, well, not everybody, but so many people have camera phones, and so many people are online, I think you need to be very aware that everything you do as an organization might potentially be seen by many people. And I think it's very important to do social media monitoring, just for a few keywords to see, is there anybody who has a problem with my program and is talking about that online, so that you can then, address that problem. I mean, it's essentially customer service. But because if you don't, then all of a sudden your reputation might be damaged online and you're not even aware of that.
How does that work when you're building employee policies or staff policies as well? Do you have to monitor staff, and are there limits?
I don't think you have to monitor staff. I think you have to have trust in your staff and try to hire competent staff. I think, the rules for, social media use they're not rocket science. I always, my kind of main rule, like when teaching people or when having a workshop around social media for staff, is always, think about your mother, your boss, and CNN. That means if you're about to post something on Facebook or Twitter or wherever, and you don't think your mother would want to see that, and you think you might have a problem if your boss saw it, and if you think you could be in really big trouble if this video clip or photo was shown on CNN tomorrow, then it's probably not a good idea to post it.
So many times that probably appropriate. So then let me ask you this. Are there places in the world right now that you maybe have been paying attention to or monitoring that have made you cringe, where you've either watched communications from humanitarian organizations or governments or such? I'm thinking of places like Thailand right now, or the Ukraine or Syria. Are there examples where you're like, oh, wow, why did they just say that? Or man, they could have really leveraged this event differently?
Yes, there was an example I was involved in, but I can't really talk about that.
Oh, okay.
Let me think. How can I phrase it that it doesn't? There was an issue that, as communication officers, we thought would be a good advocacy opportunity, but where then senior management, was not comfortable talking about the issue, and in our opinion, that was like a missed opportunity. That certainly happened.
Do you find that you have to arm wrestle quite a bit with leadership and other managers when you have something that you think is worthwhile? The two thoughts there. One is, we work in an industry where everyone's too busy, everyone's overloaded, and so it's really easy to dismiss the communications aspect.
Yeah, I find interestingly that it's easier in the field than at headquarters because people in the field are more busy. I think communication products frequently suffer from too many iterations. I think most things benefit from 2 drafts or something like that. But after 2 drafts, you kind of, the value you get for each additional draft just goes down rapidly, and it very quickly just turns into words that has no real added value. And in the field, nobody has time for that. So in the field, I find decisions get made much more faster. And if you go to somebody and say okay, here's something that I think we should say, can you have a look at that? Then normally there's one iteration where somebody says no, I'm not quite comfortable with that. Can you try to do this differently? We come back with, one changed version, and normally it's good to go. Of course, there are always people who are uncomfortable with, communication in general and think it's a waste of time, but, those people are just never going to change.
2 more questions. Have you ever become the story?
Fortunately not.
You've worked in all of these dangerous and, sort of disaster-prone areas, and you've never had that opportunity. Have you ever
actually, you know what? That's not true. That's actually not true. But I was not in a communication role. It was an interesting experience. I was working for ICSC as a protection delegate, and they sent a communications delegate and a cameraman to where I was working to do a story about the work I was doing. So there I was on the other side. But Yes, I was not there as a comms delegate. That's why I didn't think of it.
Oh, okay. What advice would you give to people? This is a question that we always end our interviews with. But you've had a good run in a career. You've made the jump to be an interprofessional. It sounds like that practice is flourishing. Do you have a core piece of advice that you'd give to someone who's interested in working in humanitarian aid or development, and specifically in communications?
Yeah, more in general, I just say you need to bring something to the table. I think there's still a lot of people who think that, it's about, going somewhere and, having the attitude, to just help people and to do good. And that is certainly something that should be one of your core values. But that is not good enough. Particularly if you want to work in the field, bringing you there, having accommodation and everything for you is very, very expensive on top of your salary. And need to bring something to the table that justifies those costs. Because, if possible, that job should always go to a national, because, it's a whole different discussion, but it's a national is probably always going to, be better at many things than you are. So if you want to do it, you need to have something to bring to the table, and that means you need to have professional skills, and you need to have work experience and problem-solving skills, so that you also function in slightly disorganized environment.
Timo, thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome, and thank you for having me.
You've been listening to Terms of Reference, a weekly podcast from aidpreneur.com. Find us on iTunes or at www.aidpreneur.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.